Tonight, leaving behind a loud and suffocating Seattle, Elias Vance began to drift deep beneath the waves of his own consciousness, entering a realm of total darkness, a place that holds the vast majority of the human inner world yet remains a forever alien territory rarely explored. The 42-year-old man, holding the title of Director of Data Analytics, was trapped in an endless loop of meaningless meetings and a hustle culture that drained every last drop of his strength. On the surface of his current life, his mind was like a sea snarling with rage from the storms of electronic notifications, frantic deadlines, and countless performance metrics weighing on his shoulders. Elias had spent too many years swimming tirelessly on that surface, clinging to lifebuoys named self-improvement. Books, trying to optimize every moment of existence in exchange for a vague concept of perfection. Yet, in the middle of a quiet office on a high floor overlooking the city lights, a panic attack struck, tightening his chest and exposing the state of ultimate exhaustion of a soul trapped on the surface. At that most suffocating moment, as his heart drummed a rapid beat, a non-physical presence began to rise from the silences between his tangled thoughts, a voice that was calm, deep, and possessed the sharp wit of the guide. This voice did not offer cliched advice or demand that he continue to fight and stay strong, but instead, it whispered a strange invitation to stop struggling and let go completely, to sink freely. The guide gently pointed out that the desperate effort to stay afloat in stormy waters was the true cause of his suffocation, and the only solution now was to surrender forced control. This invitation brought a strange comfort, challenging all of Elias' core beliefs about always needing to hold the steering wheel of life, opening a meditative space where he began a spectacular let-go into the infinite silence of his own heart. That this surrender led Elias across the threshold of a quiet sanctuary, slowly sinking into the hazy twilight waters of consciousness where the last rays of sun were fading away. Along with the shifting colors from a vibrant blue to a deep indigo, all the blinding lights representing expectations, urgent reports, and the hollow fame of the world above also began to dim and vanish. In this half-light space, his heart began to slow to the rhythm of a weightless world, yet simultaneously, a new sensation overwhelmed his mind, the massive weight of pressure. The black mass of water above represented the suffocating pressure of countless social obligations, harsh judgments, and paradigms of success that were constantly pressing down on his fragile body from all sides. Just as Elias instinctively tried to steel himself against that pressure, the guide whispered again through the invisible vibrations of the water, carrying a sharp truth that nature has preserved for millions of years. The voice explained slowly that the only way for deep-sea creatures to survive under pressure that could crush solid steel was not to don hard armor, but to learn to become absolutely flexible. We are often taught to build strong defensive walls to protect the ego from the storms of life, but it is precisely that rigidity that turns our souls into brittle objects that easily crack when pushed to the limit. In these depths, survival requires an art of osmosis, a supple bending that allows the massive pressure to pass through the filter of the mind without encountering any resistance. Elias began to realize that constantly resisting the demands of the outside world only depleted precious energy, while true freedom lay in relaxing the boundaries of the self, letting those heavy expectations merge with his breath and gently slip away into the void. When he stopped fighting and let his spiritual body blend completely into the silent pressure, the 1,000-pound burden suddenly became weightless, carrying him deeper into the mysterious gloom. Without any fear. When absolute flexibility had dissolved all the weight of the pitch-black darkness above, the invisible feet of Elias' consciousness finally touched the deepest floor of the silent kingdom. Unconsciously, he had assumed that the end of letting go was merely a tasteless, empty void, but the guide gently pulled back the curtain of perception to show him that the ocean floor was not a flat and empty plain. Looming in his inner vision was a breathtakingly majestic landscape of a mountain system stretching across the entire globe, where the longest mountain range on Earth quietly extended itself, hidden beneath the deep waters. Standing before the greatness of this mid-ocean ridge, Elias suddenly realized that the true structure of the ego was just like this rugged terrain, not at all smooth or perfect like the portrait he tried to paint on the social surface, but a jagged surface full of the flaws of time.The warm, resonant voice of the guide led him closer to observe the peaks and valleys, where there were areas split by deep fissures and steep, treacherous walls. Those deep tectonic faults revealed a raw truth: they were the embodiment of countless psychological crises, fractures of faith, and invisible pains that Elias had intentionally covered up throughout more than 40 years of his life. Instead of denying or avoiding those dark valleys filled with the scars of the past, as he usually did when facing a breakdown, Elias was now taught to silently admire them as the most sacred relics of the soul. Each tectonic crack was not evidence of weakness or permanent failure, but a vivid mark proving he had truly lived, truly fractured, and had bravely exposed his core foundation before the violent changes of human existence. Standing silent before the massive tectonic cracks filled with the flaws of the past, Elias began to notice a smoldering and intense movement happening at the deepest point of the breakdown. At the very place where those deep cracks seemed hopeless, hot lava representing the most primal emotions was constantly rising and cooling as it touched the cold water to form a completely new crust. The simple voice of the guide rose again, blending into the silent magma, illuminating a profound philosophy that the ultimate pains he had tasted were never the tragic end he had imagined, but in fact, a great workshop where his withered ego was being continuously renewed. For decades on the noisy surface, he had wasted immense energy hiding his emotional wounds because he always feared that a collapse would define his fate, but at the bottom of this abyss, the planet was using those painful faults to create new lands, fresher and sturdier than ever. The pristine new crust born from the fracture did not have a perfectly smooth surface, but it contained a resilient vitality tempered by inner fire and the massive pressure of the vast ocean. Through that sacred meditative lens, Elias relaxed his mind to feel the warmth of rebirth, deeply understanding that he did not need to scream or show off his ascent to the surface world, because the miracle of self-healing always takes place in absolute silence. There would be no loud cheers or cliched instructions, only a quiet and patient rhythm of creation constantly building the surface of his soul piece by piece, turning the most painful fragments into a solid foundation for him to continue existing amidst the vastness of life. Leaving the fire of rebirth at the tectonic rifts, Elias continued to drift gently across the infinite abyssal plains of the conscious ocean. In that cold, still space, his inner eyes began to recognize a miraculous phenomenon occurring around him as marine snow fell lightly from the sunlit waters far above. The guide spoke in a deep, reflective tone, explaining that those soft, shimmering snowflakes were actually organic remains, fragments of deceased organisms or waste discarded by the surface world. Up there, Elias had always considered unfinished projects or moments of unproductive distraction as useless things to be discarded immediately to maintain a perfect machine. However, witnessing those redundant fragments patiently drifting to the depths to become essential nutrients feeding an entire giant ecosystem in the dark, he suddenly woke up and reevaluated the true definition of usefulness: that the cluttered thoughts that we often consider redundant or crushing failures on the noisy surface are actually the silent food source quietly nourishing the profound depths of the soul. No experience is wasted in the universe of the interior, because it is the painful waste left behind from the exhausting race that forges a resilient endurance and a deep wisdom within him. As Elias watched the snow gently cover the sediment, he no longer saw the waste of time, but only a deep gratitude for every fragment that had fallen from the past, patiently building a solid foundation of peace that no storm on the surface could disturb. Leaving the drizzling marine snow that brought life, Elias continued to drift to spaces even more solitary and silent, where there was a complete absence of abundant biological remains. Stretching infinitely beneath his feet now was a layer of clay stained a rusty red, built up from fine dust particles and tiny minerals that fell very sparsely. The quiet voice of the guide spoke softly in the empty space, telling him that this red clay accumulated so slowly that time here must be measured in millions of years. Under the pressure of the blinding digital age on the water, Elias had always lived like a programmed machine addicted to instant results, spinning with reports measured in seconds and short-term goals that exhausted the mind. He was always terrified if a day passed without seeing clear progress, mistakenly believing that standing still was a sign of failure. But in the deepest place of this planet, even a tiny thickness of sediment represented a span of time so long it was difficult for a human to imagine that the most minimalist diary of the ocean does not bother to record noisy events or fleeting achievements, but only patiently preserves the most fundamental and primal rhythm of the planet. Looking at the red clay sitting in silence, waiting and gathering even the thinnest dust particles as the world above changed again and again, Elias suddenly felt a supreme relief surge in his chest. He realized the true art of living does not lie in rushing forward to force results, but in learning the great patience of the seabed, allowing oneself to slow down and understand that the sturdiest foundations of the soul always need very long chapters of time to quietly take shape. Leaving the great patience of the red clay plains, the invisible current continued to sweep Elias toward a strange terrain rising out of the deep night, where he began to explore systems of black smokers erupting violently. Before him now were towers of minerals billowing out surreal, scorching liquids, creating a surprising oasis in the middle of the vast oceanic desert. The meditative voice of the guide rose, slowly reminding Elias of an illusion he had always cherished on the surface, the blind belief that all growth and flourishing must require light. Until now, Elias had always craved the bright light of recognition, hollow praises, and clinging love from others to validate his own existence in the busy city. However, this vibrant ecosystem at the bottom of the sea was a testament to a completely opposite miracle, showing that even when the sunlight representing all recognition and love from the outside world was entirely absent, life here still stubbornly flourished and grew strong. These strange creatures did not look up to wait for a favor from the sky, but trained themselves in a philosophy of absolute independent existence. Standing before the spectacular sight of hydrothermal towers burning in the dark, Elias suddenly understood the lesson of lighting one's own path, realizing that he could completely find an infinite source of heat and primal strength from his own darkest faults. By turning inward to tap into the power of his most somber and lonely corners, he was no longer a beggar for light on the surface, but had become an autonomous ecosystem, warming his own soul amidst the cold of human life. Standing still before the black columns erupting with primal energy, Elias witnessed a biological miracle that the surface world rarely dares to believe is true. The guide's deep voice sounded like a wake-up call, explaining in detail the concept of chemosynthesis, a miraculous process where the seabed ecosystem does not crave warm rays for photosynthesis but uses dark chemical compounds to sustain life. For many years on the ground, Elias had imprisoned himself in the weary trap of cliched self-improvement books, those that always preached that humans can only develop when bathed in the light of positivity, encouragement, and forced optimism. He always felt guilty and weak whenever bitterness, loneliness, or pressure crushed his mind, fearing it was a poison that would kill his soul if not quickly purged. Yet, at the deepest part of this ocean, tiny microorganisms were leisurely using the energy hidden in deadly compounds like hydrogen sulfide erupting from cracks to manufacture sugar and organic matter, turning raw chemistry into living fuel to nourish an entire brilliant community in the dark. Seeing how nature transforms harshness into nutrients for survival, Elias suddenly realized a great escape from his own cycle of exhaustion. He understood that he did not need to deny or run away from the resentment, panic, or anger boiling in his chest anymore, because they could entirely become excellent raw materials for inner chemosynthesis. The guide whispered in his ear that true liberation does not come from bleaching the mind into a sterile, flawless space, but from learning to digest the bitterness of reality, turning the suffocating pressure of isolation into a still and majestic strength. By courageously accepting and absorbing the darkest emotions instead of chasing them away, Elias began to build a solid, independent spiritual fuel, freeing himself from the desire to seek illusory light and proudly existing through the deep reactions quietly occurring in his own heart. Leaving the hydrothermal towers. With the great power of chemosynthesis, the inner flow continued to carry Elias through another dark, silent space before he stopped in astonishment. On the cold mud of the bottom, a majestic and mournful scene appeared. Elias witnessed an ecosystem growing from the carcass of a giant whale. Thousands of tiny creatures were diligently gathered around the great remains, turning a death that seemed tragic and lonely into a bustling oasis of life in the middle of the oceanic desert. The deep voice of the guide spoke softly in his mind, gently leading him toward the corners of himself that had never been forgiven, where the dilapidated ruins of a passionate youth were hidden. At the moment of silently watching that white skeleton bestowing life, he faced his own whale, a cherished project that had collapsed in Seattle, leaving him in depression. That ruined business career had once been a massive block of pain that crushed the self-esteem of the 42-year-old man, sending him into a free fall into the abyss of chronic exhaustion and long nights of endless self-torment. He had always seen that collapse as an unfixable stain, a rotting corpse reeking of failure that he desperately wanted to hide from the judgmental eyes of the surface world. But now, through the wise and compassionate lens of the abyss, Elias stood calmly watching the form of his own decline without any fear or denial, beginning to feel deeply that the giant ruins thought to be dead actually carried within them a different pulse of survival waiting to be opened. Standing quietly before the great skeleton thrumming with the life of countless tiny creatures, Elias heard the guide's voice rise like a hymn of devotion. The voice explained slowly that when a whale takes its last breath and sinks, the deep seabed suddenly receives an unexpected gift, carrying a massive source of concentrated food. The death of that great creature was not a tragic end or a meaningless waste, but in fact, it created temporary oases, nourishing life on the seabed for many decades. Under the guidance of the invisible Zen master, he watched intently as the remaining bones continued to patiently provide nutrients for all species for many years, turning cold remains into a long story constantly unfolding on the mud of the ocean floor. Looking at the evolutionary path of this magical underwater neighborhood, where one group of organisms after another took turns residing and multiplying, Elias suddenly understood the great philosophy of failure. He realized that the collapse of his cherished project years ago in Seattle was not a death sentence for his value as a human, but was the most complete devotion to breaking the shallow shell of arrogance. Now, he began to shed the burden of resentment and learn to forgive himself, deeply understanding that those painful ruins were silently decomposing to become an invaluable source of nutrition. That ultimate failure was patiently nourishing and seeding a version of Elias that was much deeper, sturdier, and calmer than the man previously obsessed with perfection. Thanks to the whale carcass of the past, the withered land of his soul was truly reborn, compassionately. Embracing stumbles and proudly existing with a deep, eternal beauty. Leaving the oasis of life thriving around the whale remains, Elias continued to let himself drift with the silent flow of the conscious ocean. The seabed now opened into a flat terrain, where crossing the plains of red clay were artificial lines stretching endlessly, winding close to the topography and sinking into deep basins. He realized with shock that these were the undersea fiber optic cables quietly lying across the ocean floor, connecting continents with massive streams of data and carrying almost all the world's internet traffic. Sharing a space where the Earth's new crust was formed and sediment accumulated over ages, countless messages, calls, and videos of humanity were still constantly moving in the form of light pulses gliding through glass fibers. The warm and slightly humorous voice of the guide rose rhythmically with the flow, reminding Elias of a paradox of solitude. The seabed consists not only of geology and biology, but it is also the infrastructure foundation silently supporting the daily life occurring above the waves. The guide pointed out that the human mind carries a similar structure, showing that even if he could withdraw into the absolute silence of his own heart, he would never be permanently disconnected from humanity. Previously, whenever exhausted by work, Elias believed that freedom only came when he cut off all contact and fled from noisy society. But as he watched the cables lying obediently under massive water pressure while still persistently transmitting the heartbeat of the world, he understood that inner independence does not mean an extreme rejection of the world. He could completely maintain a silent, inviolable space deep within himself, as still as the vast ocean, while still allowing the invisible threads of human connection to flow through without feeling disturbed or losing himself. Leaving the fiber optic cables carrying the noisy heartbeat of humanity, the silent current continued to take Elias deeper into the darkest corners of the subconscious, where strange shapes began to emerge from the mud. Right before his eyes, a giant sea isopod was slowly walking across the ocean floor with a calm, armored appearance. Although at first glance it looked exactly like a monstrous creature from a forgotten era, the guide gently reminded him that this giant was actually a close relative of the familiar tiny woodlouse often found hiding under rotting logs on land. Hidden further in the night, ghost eels drifted by, carrying giant mouths with jaws that could expand fully and stretchable stomachs to swallow prey nearly as large as their own bodies, occasionally flashing a cold light to lure prey before attacking suddenly. Standing before those somewhat hideous forms, Elias shivered slightly, but the deep and slightly humorous voice of the invisible Zen master spoke up in time to remove his fear. The voice explained that these creatures, which live by patiently waiting and seizing unexpected opportunities, were the perfect embodiment of the darkest parts of the human mind, representing secret desires, primal fears, and the rugged animal part always hiding beneath the veneer of civilization. On the surface, Elias had spent vast energy chasing away, denying, and trying to trim his non-standard thoughts to fit the perfect mold preached by society. However, in this kingdom of darkness, he realized that nature does not create cute or perfect shapes, but creates the most resilient survivors born to withstand unpredictable periods of famine. Instead of being terrified or trying to destroy the ghosts at the bottom of his soul, Elias began to learn to smile gently and accept their presence. He understood that true peace does not come from purging all the ugly aspects within the ego, but from learning to live in peace with imperfect differences, giving those dark parts a safe space to drift without allowing them to take away the self-esteem of his own life. Leaving the ghosts lurking in the mud, the silent flow continued to sweep Elias toward a giant narrow scar where the planet's surface was curving down to the ultimate depths. Before him now was the Mariana Trench, a long, curved valley with steep, treacherous walls immersed in a twisted, dark space. This place possessed a massive volume of water high enough to easily swallow the highest mountain on land and still have silent space left over. As he drifted further into the deepest area the planet had ever hidden, the invisible pressure from all sides tightened into an absolute force that seemed capable of crushing everything hollow. The guide's quiet voice rose in a void, slowly pointing out that this was the final natural limit of exploration, where the environment was so harsh that no fake shell could tolerate existing. In this kingdom of ultimate darkness, the massive weight of the ocean conducted the most radical stripping of Elias' entire social self. Every layer of proud armor he wore on the surface, from the imposing title of Director of Data Analytics and detailed performance reports to the heavy expectations of the city's hustle, were all crushed by the absolute pressure and dissolved completely into nothingness. No more worldly definitions could cling to this abyssal threshold, forcing him to shed all titles to face his truest essence. At that moment of total stripping, instead of feeling suffocated or destroyed by the collapse of the ego, Elias suddenly tasted a pure freedom he had never known before. He was no longer an individual full of responsibilities and pressure struggling on the noisy surface, but had been cleansed to transform into a pure, invisible consciousness, silently merging his heartbeat into the eternal silence and resting completely at the deepest point of his inner world. Just as Elias' pure consciousness was floating freely in the absolute darkness and ultimate silence of the planet's deepest trench, his inner eyes suddenly stopped at an unexpected discovery that shattered the illusion of a completely sterile land. In the very gloomiest and most isolated place, where it seemed no human impact could reach, he saw tiny microplastics and modern trash quietly stuck in the mud, drifting like soulless grains of sand and blending into the end of the ocean floor. Plastic bags or fragments of trash floating from the surface had broken down, been pushed into the abyss by the weight of time, and were held forever by the steep walls, unable to escape. The deep voice of the guide rose again in the silence, gently revealing a raw truth that high-minded philosophies or meditation retreat separated from the bustling world would never make him immune to the trash of the civilization in which he lived. Just as the deep ocean must collect and store artificial waste falling from the surface, the human mind, no matter how deep it dives, will always contain parts of darkness, ugly thoughts, toxic prejudices, and compressed fragments of hurt. Elias realized that geographic distance or fleeing into a meditative state never guarantees absolute protection from the flaws of human existence. Instead of panicking and denying or desperately trying to cleanse those last bits of dregs to force himself into a state of perfect purity, the invisible voice led him to a higher realm of liberation. That was to learn to calmly accept the presence of every microplastic fragment lurking in the sediment of the soul, allowing them to exist at the bottom of the deep trench as part of the history of past ups and downs, without giving them the power to define or tarnish the true value of his essence. Leaving the silent trench where microplastic remains drifted harmlessly, Elias' pure consciousness continued to be pulled by an underlying force toward the edge of giant subduction zones. Before him now was no longer a landscape standing still under the ravages of time, but a majestic boundary, where the old oceanic crust was curving, cracking, and sliding down into the deepest depths of the hot mantle. The deep voice of the guide spoke again, carrying a cold but liberating truth that the seabed never exists forever as a permanent prison for heavy sediments. The invisible Zen master slowly explained that while the continents on land always stubbornly cling on for billions of years, much like humans hold on to their proud shells, the oceanic crust bravely chooses a shorter life cycle because it is always ready to bend back inward to receive a radical recycling. Standing on the brink of this tectonic transformation, Elias suddenly understood the great philosophy of the death of the ego. He realized that to truly shed the suffocating block of anxiety accumulated over more than 40 years of his life, he could not simply carry that old and dilapidated self for a stroll under the sea, but had to gather all his courage to step to the brink of the regenerative furnace. The feeling of terror at disappearing began to give way to a voluntary surrender as Elias realized that the version of the director of data analytics burdened by fake expectations had fully completed its historical mission. To make room for a completely new stillness, he had to bravely allow the tectonic plate named the weary self to slide out of the safe zone, accepting being swallowed and melted by the terrifying heat of the deepest heart. Letting the agonizing past be swept into the mantle furnace was not a punishment or a tragic destruction, but a supreme ritual of cleansing, where all the most rigid and cliched limits of the mind were forced to break to clear the way for a brilliant rebirth waiting ahead. As the tectonic fragment named Elias voluntarily slid deep into the subduction zone, a most radical and intense process of letting go began to take place in the heart of the fiery planet. The terrifying heat and infinite pressure of the mantle did not bring pain as he had feared, but instead brought a strangely smooth melting. Every layer of rigid prejudice about success, the binding social molds, and the countless cruel judgments he had once imposed on himself throughout 40 long years now began to melt, completely changing their solid structure to become a glowing stream of lava. The calm voice of the guide wove through every bubbling gas bubble, whispering that this was the most miraculous moment of existence, when old matter was not destroyed but was only being transformed to return to its most primal and pure form. He was no longer the imposing director of data analytics from Seattle, no longer the failure of the past, or a machine that had to constantly race against time to affirm his value. Along with the collapse of those defining boundaries, a supreme sense of relief surged, bringing absolute and infinite freedom as he realized he no longer had to struggle to become someone in the narrow world. The entire withered and anxiety-laden ego had now transformed into a bright red flow of magma, full of vitality and infinite potential, a warm and flexible current ready to nourish any new life preparing to rise from the depths. This radical melting did not take anything of true value from Elias. Rather, it released all the energy once imprisoned in the boulder of pride and fear, allowing him to enjoy a wonderful state of selflessness, where he completely belonged to the great heartbeat of nature and was ready to let the silent lava inside him freely lead the way. From within that state of pure, glowing lava, an invisible force began to lift Elias' consciousness, gently taking him away from the subduction zone to begin the journey back to the surface. The guide's calm voice rose with each ascent, explaining an Archimedes principle of the soul, where the complete release of the burdens of the old ego had created an absolute lightness, becoming a natural buoyancy pulling him through every layer of dark water. Unlike previous escapes from reality, the purpose of the deep dive into the abyss was never to hide forever from the noisy world, but to pick up a great block of silence and bring it back to the surface. As he passed through the Abyssal Plains and back up through the twilight waters, the massive pressure gradually loosened, but Elias did not lose the sturdiness he had just been tempered with. The invisible Zen master reminded him that the true art of liberation is how to preserve the vast silence inside the chest even as the rays of social expectation and the noisy sounds of civilization are beginning to reappear above. He did not need to steel himself or rebuild defensive walls when preparing to face the real world, because now, the entire silent and deep ocean had been absorbed and shrunk into a steady heartbeat right in his heart. The closer he got to the boundary of the water's surface, the more Elias felt a majestic composure, confidently carrying the patient rhythm of sediment, the independent strength of hydrothermal towers, and the great compassion of the seabed to prepare for any storm life was about to throw. When the soft light of early morning in Seattle began to pierce through the frosted glass of the office, Elias Vance slowly opened his eyes and realized he was sitting in the very armchair where the panic had once started. On the desk, the phone screen still constantly flashed with dozens of new notifications and frantic deadlines, but now, all that noise and pressure suddenly became as harmless as ripples on a wide sea. The 42-year-old man was no longer a small wave easily pushed by the wind. Because he had brought the vast capacity and eternal stillness of the ocean deep into his chest. Elias' story is a testament to the profound human value that true liberation does not lie in running away from a harsh reality, but in finding a solid anchor right in the faults and darkness of the soul. Through this deep-sea journey, we draw the lesson that the inner world is like the ocean floor, a great machine always quietly operating to recycle failures into new opportunities and turn pressure into the strength of perseverance. If this journey brought you a bit of relief and helped you unwind after a long day, we invite you to subscribe to the channel, like, and share the video to help other curious souls find their way back to peace. How do you feel about Elias' story? And have you ever realized the undersea cables connecting your soul with humanity even in your most lonely moments? We look forward to hearing your sincere shares and comments from the bottom of your heart about how you face the storms on the water in your real life. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a happy life, and that every passing day is truly peaceful in your soul. Thank you sincerely for listening, goodbye, and see you in the next video.